Hello there, this is your professional yapper speaking and welcome back to today's Zeeebo's TED Talk. So we are back again to talk about gacha, but this time around on a different topic. So I'll say 2 days back, I released Zeeebo's TED Talk episode 3, where we discussed about my free-to-play gacha plan for my VN free-to-play account. And I think people get the misconception that I'm not recommending the twins, right? Like, I will have to actually correct that. I have been pushing for the twins. If you have watched my channel long enough, and if you have seen most of my twins video, I'm generally positive about twins, and I think they are quite meta changing, right? But in comparison to the resources to get them to Supreme Plus, it might be a little bit too much for my free-to-play account at the current stage of the game. So I did rather devote the resources into Freya Store for that account specifically. So that video was never about Celestial Hypogean priorities. It was more about my free-to-play plan because of the situation that I'm put into. So that's a disclaimer, right? So since we are on the topic of the Celestial Hypogean, today's topic will be what tiers is the best for your Celestial Hypogean character? Is it M+, S tier, S+, or the Paragon tier? So for this question, let's bring up my own hero board over here. So right now, if you take a look at like the current meta as well as like the current like most recommended tiers for your Celestial Hypogean characters, I'll say it's S+, because Supreme Plus is where most of your units will be able to get the max value on their basic stats. So once you go to the Supreme Plus tier, as you guys can see, so from Supreme Plus to the Paragon 1 tier, the increase is pretty insignificant in terms of the basic stats. So this is where most units will be good enough at Supreme Plus tier, provided if you're only using them for PvE purposes. So this is a tier increase from Epic Plus to Legendary, and this tier increase is sort of like I'll say like slowly increasing, but it's linear in a slowly increasing manner. So that's how I can put it. So most of the basic stats, they are maxed out at the Supreme Plus tier, and if you're using the unit for the DPS side, for example like Tailin, right? Me using Tailin for PvE contents, then more than enough. Paragon stats, first of all, is for your PvP centric contents, where you get that bonus rivalry stats for your units to perform at all these game modes, which I mentioned multiple times. So the only time where you would consider upgrading the Celestial Hypogean to beyond the Supreme Plus tier would be if you want to use them for these game modes. Now, for this season specifically, S+ has been sort of greatly improved, because even at the Supreme Plus tier, not only do you get the maximum basic stats, but you get your Supreme Plus Q, which is quite important for certain Celestial Hypogean character, and more importantly, you get the rivalry stats on your Supreme Plus Celestial Hypogean characters. So this means that even at just Supreme Plus, your Celestial Hypogean characters performs on par with a Paragon 1 normal unit in all your PvP game modes in general. So that's for the damage comparison side as well as the PvP side. So the only time where you would consider upgrading the Paragon tier is for the PvP side, but in most cases, Supreme Plus is sufficient more for most of the Celestial Hypogean characters, at least if you are more concerned about the PvE contents. So that's number one. Okay, now let's say if you have a certain unit at a certain tier, how do you decide whether or not the unit is usable, right? How do you decide whether or not, hey, it is sufficient? Should you commit to other units? Because I've seen this question a lot. Hey Zeep, I got M+ XXX. Should I commit to another unit? Hey Zeep, I have L+ XXX. Should I change to another unit? So my answer to that is it's dependent on a few situations. Okay, one, how much of the S+ abilities you need on certain units. For example, like for Elijah and Lila, S+ is massive, right? It allows them to get like additional stats on your allies, further increasing your DPS, and 15%, it's quite big, and it scales with stats. So S+, very important for Elijah and Lila, right? For Harak's case, S+ also really important, because you get energy recovery on your ultimate, which is your key part of your control immunity as well as DPS to allow that ultimate spamming engine to keep on running. So pretty important for Harak. If we take a look at Skalita, also decently important, right? Not so important as compared to last time when she was dominating, but still really important if you are using Scarlita for the shielding and utility portion. So that's for the comparison. If you take a look at Barrel, hey, if you take a look at Barrel, is Barrel's S+ ability that powerful? I guess from a PvP aspect it is, but on the PvE side, maybe not so much. So this is where you consider, hey, do I need to bring the character to S+? If the character's S+ skill is game changing and the character actually needs the S+ skill to be really good, then that's where you definitely need to upgrade them to the S+ level itself. Now, another thing to decide whether or not you stop at M+, S, or S+ is whether or not the unit is good enough at Mythic+. So why Mythic+? Because at the Mythic+ tier, this is where you get the EX weapon of the unit, and EX weapon sometimes is more important compared to your stats as well as your Supreme Plus abilities itself. For example, Reyna in this case, this unit is one of the Celestial Hypogean that often is recommended to just be M+ for most accounts, because this unit's role is to send in an ally, mostly to give the heal to the ally as well as buff the allies while debuffing the enemy over here with the M+ ability. So the rest of the kit is additional damage, which is not what Reyna does for the team, and the additional buff from the hero focus is more than sufficient when you get him to M+. So for the S+ ability right here, you do get a stat increase on Reyna, but then considering the fact that you need to upgrade him from M+ to S, which is 2 copies, and then from S to S+ for this ability, it's not that massive. Because if you compare this to, for example, Elijah and Lila's ability, you can see the clear difference in quality for the Supreme Plus skill. And that's where, if you don't rely on Reyna that much for the stats and you don't actually rely on the stats for the abilities itself, then this unit is perfectly fine at the Mythic Plus tier. So that is the very first criteria, right? But for damage dealers like the likes of Scarlita, Talin, Harap, for example, it's a different case, right? So for Talin's case, the Supreme Plus skill is not very impactful. So Talin is a unit where she needs the stats to do damage. So that brings me to another point, and that is, are you doing enough damage for you to secure your ranks? So if the answer to that is a yes, then Talin's EX weapon is good enough to be at Supreme tier. So that is for Talin's case, or rather her tier is okay to be at the Supreme tier, because at the Supreme tier you will be able to get, I'll say, like at least 90% of her stat values, and then you will be able to get her EX weapon all the way to EX 15, where you will be able to get this really good ability right here. So for Talin's case, S is okay, provided you're not using her in the PvP side, because like I mentioned earlier, if you do upgrade her to the Supreme Plus tier, you do get a little bit of rivalry stats, which makes her a lot better in the PvP side, where Talin actually excels right now. So that is the point of consideration. But if you're using Talin mostly for your damage related content, for her AoE prowess as well as her magical damage prowess, then S is actually okay. So that is like M, S, you know. For Barrel's case, you can even use Barrel at just like S tier, for example, because like Barrel's S+ ability isn't that strong. But then, like I mentioned, you will lose out a little bit of stats on these units, and then on the PvP side, obviously you want as much stats as possible. So now for the very last 2 pointers, whether or not you should get the unit up, right, other than obviously the cost to get the unit up, is number 1, how often are you using that unit? So for example, there are certain units that are super niche, like Barrel over here, that you mostly use with specific synergies or specific teams, whereas there are other units like Fresto, which goes really well, or like, okay, let's put Fresto up here for the discussion. So there are certain units that are really flexible, that goes really well in almost every game mode, in almost every content, and you use this unit almost every single day. So obviously, if you use the unit a lot more, then getting the units up in terms of the tiers would be the way to go. For example, for my free-to-play account, let me reiterate why I'm upgrading Fresto to Supreme Plus, and that is because I use Fresto on a day-to-day basis on that account. I use Fresto for my AFK stage push. I use Fresto for my damage-related contents for the Dream Realm side, at least in the end game, at least that's what I see. And then I also see Fresto being used in my PvP contents almost on every single team that I can put him into. So in terms of the feasibility as well as the flexibility, Fresto definitely has it, and that's why on my free-to-play account I'm committing to him on S+, because that way I get the most out of him, at least on the PvE side, and I do get some additional bonus on the PvP side with the rivalry stat bonus on Supreme Plus. So that's the rationale for Fresto recommendation on that free-to-play account. Not for everyone. If you have the resources, you definitely want to have your vertical investment. If you guys like to hear more about horizontal versus vertical investment, let me know down in the comment section below. But that's the feasibility and flexibility part. Okay, last but not least, how competitive is your server? So not every meta unit is a must pull if your server is not overly competitive. You have to put a weightage on the amount of money, the amount of resources you're willing to spend in the game to get the results you want in the game itself. So there are obviously players out there who can easily spend thousands of dollars to get their Celestial Hypogean characters to like Paragon tiers, Paragon 3, Paragon 4 on the very first day that the game is released. However, does that apply to you? Are you gonna spend thousands of dollars every single time a Celestial Hypogean characters drop? So if the answer is yes, then by all means just purchase all the Celestial Hypogean characters. But if the answer is no, then that's where you have to sift through all the reasons I mentioned earlier. Right, competitiveness in your server. How much do you need the units for you to keep your rank? Do you need to save up your resources for you to commit to the unit? And more importantly, do you like the unit and do you use the unit a lot? So this is where your resource management comes in, because Celestial Hypogean is indeed one of the most expensive units in the game. If you consider the amount needed just to get the units to Supreme Plus. So for the Supreme Plus tier side, you need 14 copies in order for you to get to the Supreme Plus tier. So assuming you get like 1 copy every 30 summons, which is, I'll say, pretty optimistic, because there are certain extremes where you get really good gachas every 10-20 summons you get 1 copy. There are certain extremes where you get 1 every copy on every 40 summons. So I'll just put it at every 30 you get 1 copy. You will still need easily, I'll say, like 500 plus summons to get the units to Supreme Plus tier. So 500 Stellar Crystal, how much does that cost? If you go into the trolley over here, if you take a look at the bundles in terms of the Celestial Hypogean one, we have some limited bundles over here. So I bought the limited Stargaze bundle one, which I think is insanely good value. So if we were to just take, for example, the Stargaze limited bundles right here, right, 65, 3,250. So if 3,000 crystals is about 100 USD, you will need at least, right, at least 7 to 8 times of this for you to get like your Supreme Plus. 7 to 8 times. So that's easily 700 plus 800 USD. And then if you factor in the temporal essence, yeah, you guys get where I'm going. So like, it is not easy to get a day 1 Supreme Plus character. So you have to place the weightage of all the factors I mentioned earlier to how much resources you can master. Right, so obviously the true cost is a little bit lower because we do get like all the stellar crystals in the Emporium shops, as well as through all the events and stuff. But I'm just using it as a gauge for you guys to actually sort of calculate, right, how much it exactly costs to get your units up there. So if a unit is good enough at S and you are not using the unit as much, keep the unit at S and then develop into other characters. Right? If a unit is good enough outside of PvP, used in just PvE side, S is good enough, go ahead. If the unit works just at M+ like Reyna, go ahead. M+ is good enough. But for a unit like Harak, for example, that unit needs quite a bit of stats because stats makes this unit a lot better, giving him more bonus of the EX weapon skill right here, and gives him the ability to steamroll better because he now has more numbers for him to do more damage. So there are certain units which are a lot better the more stats you have on them, and obviously S plus is the way to go minimally. So that's for the S plus, S, M plus, or even Paragon tier for your Celestial Hypogean discussion. So that's pretty much it, just my personal take on this topic. Let me know what you guys think with regards to this topic, and whether or not you have certain pointers I might have missed out that I could discuss in future videos or in the Zeee future TED Talks itself. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll see you guys again in my next AFK journey video. Bye guys!